Welcome, folks. My name is Neil Havlick, and this is the Lunch with the League with the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. Today, we have a program of our Lunch with the League entitled, How Do We Protect Our Communities Against Wildfire? And our presenter today is a gentleman from the Los Padres Forest Watch. His name is Bryant Baker. And Bryant is the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres Forest Watch, which is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Barbara that is dedicated to protecting Los Padres National Forest and other public lands in the region, which, by the way, include the Carrizo Plain. Bryant is a graduate of the University of Arkansas, where in his research there, he focused on aquatic chemistry and biology on both forested and urbanized watersheds in the Ozark Mountains. In California, and with the Los Padres Forest Watch, his research focuses on the fire ecology of chaparral and forest ecosystems in California, and he has published peer-reviewed scientific papers about wildfire mitigation strategies. Brian is a GIS analyst and cartographer, and his maps, which are excellent on land use and wildfire, have been published in many places, such as the LA Times, San Diego Tribune, the Montana Free Press, Mother Jones, Oregon Public Broadcasting, and other media outlets. In addition to his conservation work and research, Bryant is a plant and landscape photographer, and he specializes in post-fire habitats and native plants in California. And his work has appeared in books, magazines, and newspapers throughout the area. So Bryant, why don't you go ahead and you can tell us about how to protect our communities against wildfire. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Neil. I'm Bryant Baker. I've been working with Los Padres Forest Watch for about 6 years now, since 2016. And you may wonder why someone who works for an organization that is dedicated to protecting the Los Padres National Forest and other public lands in the region is here to talk about how do we protect homes and communities. And that's because of this sort of connecting thread between public land management and community protection, and that thread is wildfire. We obviously have a lot of wildfire in this state and in the region, and there is this constant conversation, debate, around this issue of how do we address wildfires out in the wildlands, out in national forests and other places, but also how do we address wildfires in our communities, how they're affecting our communities. So that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. I am a photographer. This is, so you'll see a lot of my photos here. This is West Cuesta Ridge. So you're looking, this San Luis Obispo would be off that way. This is some beautiful Sargent cypress trees here and some manzanita here. This is one of the places that I will talk about, actually, this area specifically later on.
Bryant, may I just interject one thing I forgot to mention?
Sure.
For those who are watching, you can ask questions during the presentation, but do so by going down to the bottom of your screen and going to the Q&A icon there. I'm sorry, I meant to mention that before we got started. Okay, go ahead, Bryant.
Great, thanks, Neil. Okay, so let's move on here. So if you look at the 1700s and the 1800s in the United States, and you look at old newspaper articles and books and other historical documents, you will certainly find some information about wildfire and the way that we currently think about it, forest fires, fires out in wildland areas away from communities. But the types of fires that actually got the most attention by far in old newspapers, especially in the 1800s, were these urban fires that occurred in large cities across the country. Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, those are good examples of major cities that had huge urban fires multiple times throughout their early history, where you would see many, if not most, of the buildings in these urban areas burn all in the same fire event, just over a matter of hours or days. And San Francisco is unfortunately a good example here. This is just the sixth great conflagration in San Francisco in 1851. There were 5 more before it. This was probably the worst one that San Francisco experienced. About let me think, 3/4 of the city burned in this fire, about 2,000 buildings. And if you think about, so if we were maybe pre-COVID or one day post-COVID, we could be in person, and I would ask you some questions and try to see what you as the audience has in terms of like, why did this happen? Why don't we see these big city fires these days? And if we think about why did this happen, right? If we go back in time and we were to go into San Francisco in 1851, what you would see is a lot of buildings pretty tightly packed together. They were all made of wood for the most part, and they were using often lanterns and candles, open flame sources for heat and for light at night. There were horses and carriages, right? So there was a lot of hay in the city. There were a lot of places where hay had to be stored. There were all sorts of flammable materials being stored in these buildings, and all it took was for a single building to have a fire, and if the conditions were right, dry, windy conditions were present, low humidity, you could have a really big fire occur across the city. And that's exactly what happened over and over and over. And why this started to change has a lot to do with advances in various types of technology. For one, we started building cities differently and rebuilding them differently. So instead of using this cheap and seemingly limitless supply of timber from the forest of the Western United States, in these bigger cities, we started building and rebuilding these areas with other materials. We started making more fire resistant structures. We also improved the water supply in these areas to fight fires. When the telegraph was invented, that ushered in a new era of having fire alarms. That was a really key thing, so that fires could be easily put out more quickly after they started. And all of these things started to stack on top of each other. And by the early 1900s, we weren't seeing these types of huge citywide fires as much anymore. And by the mid 20th century, they were sort of a memory of the distant past. And I think about this, and the reason I'm talking about this is because when we think about community risk in terms of wildfire and community damage in terms of wildfire today, what we're actually dealing with is still an urban fire problem for the most part. If we look at some of these photos, so this is in California. This is Paradise after the Camp Fire in 2018. 18,000 plus buildings were destroyed and 85 people were killed in this fire. And if you notice, what you'll see is a bunch of burned structures surrounded by mostly green forest, right? This was a wildfire that eventually started to burn homes. And then it was mostly just burning homes. And people tend to think of fires as these things that, they come into the community, they've destroyed all the vegetation around the community, then they destroy the community itself. But this is actually what we see a lot of the time, is burned structures surrounded by green vegetation. And it's not just in the US, we see it in France this year. This is, if you were paying attention to the news last few weeks, a major heat wave was going across Europe, and we saw a lot of wildfires in Spain and France and even in the UK. And these are the sort of aftermath scenes that we're seeing. They're very similar to what we see in the US, where you have a bunch of burned structures surrounded by green vegetation. This is Greece from a few years ago. This is outside of Athens. You can see burned landscape, a lot of homes burned, but a lot of green vegetation as well, right? And I could just keep doing this. I could do this all day. Unfortunately, this is a very common phenomenon across the U.S. or across the world and the U.S. This is Australia. This is from a bushfire. There you can see a lot of green, healthy eucalyptus trees that didn't burn, and a lot of structures that did burn. So let's go back to the campfire. This is again in Paradise, and now we're looking at it from the satellite imagery, right? We're looking at it from the air, basically, and you can see that pattern here, right? Green, mostly green forest around, and a lot of burned structures all clustered together in the middle. This is really an urban fire issue more than it is a forest fire or wildland fire issue when we talk about why do homes burn in these situations. And we see it not even just in forests, but also in areas that are close to oak woodlands. This is in the Tubbs fire. This is Santa Rosa. So you can see there's a bunch of homes here, a lot of nice green vegetation. This is before the fire. Vegetation hasn't changed terribly dramatically here. This is less than a year after the fire, but you can see a lot of homes were destroyed. All of these little brown empty lots, those are where homes used to be. And just to give you a sense of the ecosystem is doing just fine after the fire. This is a few years after the fire. You can see the forest is doing all right. It's actually more like an oak woodland here with some conifers spread throughout. And you're seeing that some homes are being rebuilt and others are sort of staying empty. So why does this happen? The answer is actually very simple and very small. It's embers. Embers are the key. Homes generally do not burn because a wildfire came up to the side of the house with flames all the way from the wildland area outside of the urban area, right? So imagine you've got a forest, a fire is happening in the forest, and then flames just creep along the ground all the way to your home in some suburban setting, right? That's usually not what happens. What happens instead is that these fires, especially the ones that are burning under these extreme weather conditions, really, really dry conditions, really, really windy conditions. In Southern California, that is often Santa Ana winds. In my neck of the shrubs here in Santa Barbara, that's sundowner winds that we get here in the San Ynez Mountains. Other parts of the state, it's the Diablo winds. It's just your everyday regular winds that sometimes can get really bad. It can be a lot of different things that are causing these winds to occur, but it's usually this key element is wind, and that is blowing embers sometimes miles ahead of a fire front. And these embers are what are getting into homes through vents, through open windows or windows that have broken because debris is hitting them that is being blown by the wind. Those are the ways that embers are getting into the house, and then it's igniting on the inside, and then it starts to burn, and then that home becomes a source of embers for all of the homes around it, and so it starts spitting out embers for usually hours, at the next door neighbor's house. And then that home may start to burn, and then you have a domino effect. And that's what we see in every single one of these fire events, is this sort of ember-induced ignition and domino effects thereafter. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a wildland fire even today, right? So let's look at this is the Alameda fire in Talent, Oregon. This is just before the fire happened in 2020. This is what this town looked like right before the fire. And this is what it looked like after the fire. So you can see there's a few homes, that survived up here, but essentially this entire community was destroyed. And if you think, oh, this is a town in Oregon, it was destroyed by a wildfire, it must have been surrounded by a forest that was, set ablaze during the 2020 fires. There were a lot of major fires up in Oregon. This was actually one of the smallest fires in Oregon that year that actually caused damage to communities. And it was probably, this may have been the most destructive fire in the state that year. So we're going to zoom out. I want you to look at this and see what this town is surrounded by. It's not surrounded by forest. It's not surrounded by shrubs. It's hardly even surrounded by grasslands. It's surrounded by agriculture. you have to go many miles in any direction to actually start to get into what we would traditionally think of when we think about wildland fire and the type of vegetation that it burns in, right? And what happened with this fire was it actually started right here in this little riparian area, this river that the town was built along. It's more like a creek. And it started over in this riparian area, and then very quickly sent embers into some homes that then once again we saw that domino effect with some extreme winds, and it burned down this entire community basically. And this is what that area looked like after the fire. This was the very first this was the scene that I was showing you. Those are the homes that survived kind of close to that riparian area. But look, again, we have green trees, concrete everywhere, right? And yet most of the homes were destroyed, sadly. We saw this in Louisville in Colorado just in December of last year. So this is not the typical fire season in Colorado. You can see this is in January. This is like a few weeks after the fire that this image was taken. And there's already a ton of snow on the ground. And it's hard to tell, but this entire subdivision was destroyed basically. So you can see that there's kind of a different color, this brown, whereas you see white on the roofs here. This was all destroyed. Now let's look at it before the fire. And it was mostly surrounded by more, suburban areas and some grassland. Basically, this was not some, forest that people say are overgrown, or this isn't a bunch of, that nasty brush, the chaparral that people, often implicate in these fires. And that was not me saying that about chaparral. I love the chaparral as an ecosystem, but it's often sort of maligned when wildfires do happen and chaparral inevitably burns. So why is this happening now? Why did we have this sort of reprieve during the 20th century? And what's going on here? So remember that in the cities, in those big urban fires of the 1800s especially, we changed how we built those cities, right? We stopped using wood to make big, tall buildings. I mean, started using brick and stone and iron, right? And we started installing sprinklers inside of buildings. All of these things that actually helped pretty dramatically to reduce the incidence of those fires. But what we've done since then is we have expanded out from those urban areas, and we have built sprawling suburban areas. We have started we've built into these rural areas where we have a bunch of homes often packed together out in like really in the wildland. They may seem like they're sort of this suburban area, urban area, but they're in places that only a few decades ago might have been mostly trees or shrubs or grasses, right? So a good example of this is the Hanley Fire of 1964. This was up in the Santa Rosa area. So that's this gray shade back here. That's that fire. And it was 52,000 acres, and it burned in 1964, burned right up to the edge of Santa Rosa, and it destroyed 108 homes. Flash forward to the 2017 Tubbs Fire, that burned a smaller area, only 36,000 acres. It burned virtually the exact same spot as the Hanley Fire, and it destroyed 4,600 homes, and it killed 22 people. That's a huge difference, and there's got to be a reason for that, right? Well, let's just look at development in this area. So if we look at the same area, this is 1968. This is before you started to see some serious development on the outside of town here. And you can actually still see, this is a few years after the Hanley Fire, you can still see the remnants of where that fire burned. That's what you're seeing there. Now let's go to 2017. This is just before the Tubbs Fire. You see the difference there? And usually I can see everyone nodding their heads if we were in person, and people would go, ooh, oh my gosh. I assume you're doing that right now, but I'm going to do this. I'm just going to go back. We're going to do this one more time. So just take a real close look at this. You see some homes over here, you see some homes over here, but for the most part, this is a wildland area that we know burns because it just burned 4 years before this image was taken. And this is what it looked like 50 years later. Okay. And then the fire happened inevitably in that spot. It had happened in 1964. It was very likely that a fire like that was going to happen again. It's just that this time there were a bunch of homes in that same area. And again, a lot of the vegetation, it's not like this was all burned to a crisp as people think. The issue was the embers get into homes, and then those homes spread embers to the other homes, and that domino effect occurs. We saw this in Ventura as well. This is 1945 in right on the edge of Ventura. Actually, the city of Ventura would be quite a ways that way. It's hard to point on a screen here, but what you're seeing mostly is citrus orchards here. And then in 2015, this is what this area looked like. This is what I would call an urban peninsula into a wildland area. They basically built this neighborhood. I mean, it literally looks like a peninsula going off into the wildlands. And you can see a lot of that agriculture has disappeared in place of a bunch of homes tightly built together. And then the Thomas Fire of 2017 occurred. 60-mile-per-hour winds, Santa Ana winds drove the fire from a few miles that direction. And then it blew right through here. Embers started to get these homes on the edge, and then the domino effect occurred, and you had pretty extreme home loss here. So not only are we building new homes in places that we know have burned in the past or are likely to burn in the future, we also are we're rebuilding in places that have burned. That's for sure happening, and we're building new homes even when fires have occurred very recently, and we should absolutely know better. This is the Painted Cave Fire of 1990 in the Santa Barbara area. So this is the 101. This is Santa Barbara over here. This fire was driven by sundowner winds. It started up here, blew down just in basically a matter of hours, blew all the way down into town, destroyed 500 plus homes. And a lot of those homes were rebuilt, obviously, but gotta turn this off. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's see here. So we've got all these homes that are rebuilt, but all these black squares here, those are all homes that were built, new homes that were built just in the decade or two after the fire in this area that was obviously dangerous. This is classified as a very high fire hazard severity zone by the state. This is not a sustainable development practice, and it is happening all over the state, especially as we try to address housing issues. It is easy to just expand outward rather than to do infill development in places that are already more urbanized. That would actually be the safer thing to do from a wildfire perspective, but we continue to build out and into the wildlands, and that expands what we call the wildland urban interface, which is this area right here along the edge between the wildland areas and the urban areas. And this is often where fires start because you now put a bunch of humans into inherently flammable areas. And you've built a bunch of roads. We often see that ignitions happen along roads. And we also see power lines are a major source of ignitions, as I'll talk about in a bit. And anytime you have expansion of these types of areas, you have to power them, right? So if we look at 2020, 95%, more than 95% of all the home loss in California was caused by 0.12% of all the fires in the state that year. So a very, very small percentage of fires do most of the damage. And all of these fires have the same ingredients. It's extremely dry, you have an ignition, and you have extreme winds. That has been the case with essentially every single fire that has caused major community damage. And yet, what we focus on as a society, especially our policymakers and agencies, is trying to manipulate the vegetation out in the wildlands to prevent fires from getting to our communities. And this has proven over and over to be pretty ineffective and ecologically damaging in a lot of cases. This is the McKinney fire that is ongoing in Northern California right now. And it has burned through areas that have been logged for decades. They've had fuel reduction, all sorts of things happen on this landscape. This is up in the Klamath National Forest. And you can see there's lots of private land logging. There's a lot of Forest Service logging and fuel reduction and all sorts of things that have happened. And the fire spread really quickly throughout all of these places. And the only reason the fire has slowed down significantly was because a few days into it, it got 3 inches of rain dumped on it. And that's what we tend to see, is that these fires are driven by weather and climate. And it's a change in the weather that usually changes the fire's rate of spread and behavior. We saw this with the Caldor fire last year. This was in the Sierra Nevada, this Lake Tahoe up here. And this little town of Grizzly Flats essentially burned down. The fire started over here, very rapidly burned through areas that had been intensively managed for many years and decades. Lots of commercial thinning projects, lots of fuel reduction projects on both public and private land. And the fire still rapidly moved through this area and burned down this town. We also saw it with the Dixie Fire, a huge area burned. And we saw the entire town of Greenville essentially burned down. That was right here. And the fire moved through a lot of areas that have been pretty well managed quite intensively for many years, especially if you look up in these areas, lots of private land, forest management activities. And if you notice here, this is what I was talking about with embers. They can go miles ahead of a fire. This is a spot fire that started because embers were moving. I think I calculated it was between 5 and 8 miles. I couldn't quite figure out where the embers had landed and started a new fire. But then this fire itself became like 30,000 acres in size. So you can have really long range spotting and under these conditions. And that's why fires can get so large so quickly, is because embers can move pretty far ahead of the fire and start new fires. The North Complex, this was a really damaging fire back in 2020. It burned down much of Berry Creek here next to Lake Oroville. Fire started up here as kind of 2 separate fires that merged, but then burned under these extreme wind conditions that in a single day pushed it from right up here all the way down to Lake Oroville. And there was basically nothing that could have been done to stop that from moving across the landscape like that. And when we see these types of projects that are being proposed and approved by often like the Forest Service, for example, this is what they look like on the ground. This is the project up in the Plumas National Forest that actually burned in the Dixie Fire. This is before the project took place and before the Dixie Fire happened in 2021. And so you can see you have a pretty nice open ponderosa pine forest, and the Forest Service approved this forest health project ostensibly for fire risk reduction as well. And this is what it looked like when they were actually doing the work. So this was essentially a commercial logging project. These are all skid trails, and you've got log decks stacked up over here, slash piles, sort of all the telltale signs of a commercial logging project. But it was being done according to the agency to reduce fire risk and to improve forest health and resilience. And this is what we're seeing all over the state. And there are billions and billions of dollars being pumped into this type of work out in these remote locations. The types of trees that are being removed, the size of trees, this is me for scale. I'm about 5'10". And this is nearly a 2-foot diameter tree. This is often one of the size limits that we see. So the Forest Service is removing trees up to this size, but they often remove trees larger than that under some vague stipulations. That project that I just showed you, this one, that had a 30-inch diameter limit. So even larger trees than this were able to be removed. And in the shrublands, areas where native shrubs are dominating, like in chaparral and coastal sage scrub, what we tend to see is mastication. That's this heavy equipment that is basically just grinding shrubs down into mulch. They'll often do it to small trees as well. And we see this often is the method that is used to create what are called fuel breaks. These can be these really long, many miles long strips of land where the vegetation has been converted from usually like native shrubs. This is all chaparral that you see here. And you can see that it's been type converted to this sort of grassland ecosystem. And the almost entirely what you're seeing is this one species of non-native grass called wild oats. So they've basically just taken this strip and they've gotten rid of all the native plants in favor of this this non-native grass. And you can see, this is just, I love this photo because you can also see this power line going across this really flammable strip of land here right next to a road. You have all the ingredients here for an ignition to happen. And if that happens during, this is in the San Ynez Mountains near Santa Barbara, if that happens during sundown or wind conditions, then you're going to have a fire that will burn likely all the way down almost to the coast. So this is what we're seeing done all over the state, all over the Western United States. And there's a lot of taxpayer money going into these projects. The problem is they don't work and they particularly don't work under extreme weather conditions, those conditions that drive those 0.12% of fires that cause 95% or more of all the community damage each year. So this is that same fuel break I was just showing you. This is the Camino Cielo fuel break, right? This is Lake Cachuma, Goleta and Santa Barbara down this way. So if you're familiar with this area, that's the 101, or excuse me, that's the 154. The 101 is down this way. This is before the 2017 Whittier fire. So you can see the fuel break running along the ridge line here. And then this is after the Whittier fire in, this is early 2018. And you can see the fire actually started over here, burned up to the top of the ridge, went right over that fuel break and started coming down the mountains. And the only reason that it stopped was because it encountered some winds coming off the ocean, some really nice, cool breezes that were pushing it back toward the ridgeline. It wasn't because the fuel break helped firefighters stop the fire. The fuel break certainly didn't stop the fire on its own. And this is what we see time and time again. This is the Thomas Fire near Ojai. So Ojai is right over here. This is Lake Casitas. You can see there's this fuel break system right here along these ridge lines. And then this is after the fire. Basically everything you see burned. The fuel breaks were not particularly useful in this situation. And if you want to get closer to home, for you folks in the SLO area, this is an interesting example that I only recently learned about from Neil, actually. And so I started doing some digging into this and found some cool aerial imagery to illustrate this. So this is the Cuesta Pass. That's the 101 over there. This is West Cuesta Ridge. So this is TV Tower Road going up the ridge. This is 1963. This is what it looked like before the Forest Service put in a large fuel break along the ridge. This is 1968, and there you can see the fuel break. This is the same spot. So you can see this big wide strip of land that has been sort of converted from its native chaparral to this sort of grassy ecosystem here. And Neil could talk more about this at some point. He tried to convince the Forest Service that this wasn't the best use of time or resources and that it may cause some damage. And boy, was he right that it wasn't going to be particularly effective, because here it is in 1989. You can still see the fuel break is there. And then if you go just a few years later, 1994, this is right after the Highway 41 fire, which some of you may have been around for. And it's hard to see because this is black and white, but everything in this image burned in that fire, including the ridgeline, including that fuel break that went along it. The fire jumped this ridgeline. It did not help stop the fire. And essentially, when you look at this fuel break that went all up and down West Cuesta Ridge, it kind of bisects the fire, just like the Whittier fire. Not particularly useful. And when we see these fuel breaks actually on the ground, one of the issues with this is, again, that ecological damage that they can cause. So this is all non-native wild oats. This is basically a monoculture with a couple of native shrubs, scattered among them. This is about a year after a fire that I've been visiting for quite a while, this area that burned back in 2019 near Santa Barbara. The fire actually started in this fuel break and then burned down all the way almost to town. And this was all native chaparral. This was not part of the fuel break. And you can see there's this amazing post-fire regrowth that's happening. This is not even a year after the fire. And in the fuel break, you have all that non-native wild oats is back basically and ready to burn again. And this is the natural process playing out over here. And it's quite a beautiful one and a fascinating one. And the fuel break didn't help to keep fire out of here. And if it had, I'm not sure what good that would have done ecologically necessarily. And this is that same area. This is the cave fire near Santa Barbara. This is basically the exact same scene that you're seeing. And so you're seeing sort of different slices of it at different times, just to give you an idea of this regrowth. This is all native plants that you're seeing. Even in the fall, when things start to dry out and look dead, that's all normal part of these native plants. Some of them that go dormant during the dry season, and this is what it looks like. Now, I've written about some of these things recently. Published a couple of papers just this year about these very issues. This is a pretty big paper that me and some colleagues wrote about how we're trying to manage forest, and we're rolling a boulder up a hill most of the time, trying to prevent or fight these big fires that occur under extreme weather conditions. I also just published a paper finding that you often kill more trees in forested areas when you do thinning operations. You often kill more trees than you protect in a future wildfire, because of the actual the commercial thinning process. So this gets me to the real meat of the question here, right? How do we protect existing communities? So for one, we can try not to expand communities any further into these wildland areas that we know are going to burn in the future, and we can stop exposing people to unnecessary risk. I think that's really important to get a handle on some of these unsustainable development policies and practices. We can try to make sure that people have the ability, the means, the need, or the tools, the education to create and maintain defensible space. And I'm talking proper defensible space. You often hear from the state or from the county, you need 100 feet of clearance around your home. And that is a massive oversimplification of what the science actually suggests is useful and beneficial. So the most important zone where you can actually manage vegetation is this area just 5 feet out from the house. And this is really critical. And in fact, I recommend not having anything flammable within 5 feet of your home. So, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Up to 30 feet, you really only need to remove about 40% of the woody vegetation here. And you can leave fire-resistant vegetation, particularly like mature trees, especially our native trees like oaks that are evergreen. If you have like a coast live oak in your yard, you do not have to get rid of that to make your house safer from fire. You don't want it to necessarily be touching your house, and you need to be careful about it dropping leaves into your gutters, which I'll talk about in a second. And then beyond that area, up to really about 60 feet is sort of, that's the sweet spot. Some smart pruning and spacing between shrubs and trees is really useful. But scientists have consistently found that beyond 100 feet, you don't really gain any more protection. So you can clear a bunch of vegetation more than 100 feet away from your house, but it's diminishing returns. It doesn't improve the odds of your home surviving in a wildfire. So this is that first 5 feet. This is what I think actually, some people may not like the look of this, but this is one of the safest things you can do, is to put something like decomposed granite or some other rocky material in this 5 foot sort of buffer zone. Maybe it could even be like a sidewalk or something. What you don't want are mulch beds, especially, shrubs and other plants that it's really not so much about the plant itself than it is about what it's dropping, the leaves and twigs that it's dropping along the side of the house. All of that can catch embers during a wildfire, and then that can start to put a flame up against your house. And anytime you have that, that's a problem. Again, you can keep these larger trees, especially this is a coast live oak. I think this is a good example where you have a house that has actually done really good defensible space work. Not everyone would look at that and think, oh, this is really good defensible space. But it's pretty good when you see the entire house. And they kept a lot of their mature oaks, and those can actually even act as ember screens. They can sort of catch embers in their evergreen canopies and keep them from getting toward your house. Here's an example of what I would say is overzealous defensible space. This is taking that 100 feet of clearance to heart, I would say. This is in the Santa Monica Mountains before the Woolsey fire. Here's one of these really big homes here, and they have just really cleared all around. They actually kept a lot of vegetation right next to the home, which is maybe a little counterintuitive, and it did not help them. I would say this was a pretty intense fire. And it could have been a number of reasons why this home burned. They could have left a window open. The home may not have been built in a fire safe manner, maybe didn't have fire safe materials, but it could have been as simple as leaving a door or a window open when they evacuated, and that let embers get in. But regardless, the defensible space, it didn't really do anything here. And it was a little bit overkill, I would say. Here's another example of where defensible space doesn't always work in the way you might think. These two houses have what I would consider to be almost the exact same type of defensible space, pretty open area, surrounded mostly by, it looks like, these like lawn grasses or pasture grasses even. And they both burned in the same small wildfire here in Goleta. And one of the homes burned and one of them didn't. Sometimes it comes down to sheer random, chaos, right? How embers affect different homes. And we see that in these wildland urban interface fires where you have a bunch of homes that burn in a community. Sometimes you'll have a couple homes that are spread out and they're surrounded by homes that are in ruins. And trying to figure out exactly why some homes survived and others didn't is really difficult. But my point to all this is that defensible space can only get you so far. The whole point of defensible space is not so much to try to keep embers out of your home, right? Or to even keep flames from getting to your home, because remember, that's not how most homes burn. They don't have flames coming through and then they burn the house. What defensible space is really useful for is giving firefighters a place to operate around your house and try to put water on it and try to keep embers off, using their equipment. The issue with that is that when you have really fast moving wildfires, which is the case most of the time that you have lots of home loss, firefighters, there's not enough of them and they can't get to these places quickly and safely enough to even start doing that kind of work. So, and this is another example of defensible space that I think is just perhaps a little overkill in some ways. It's not so bad in others, but there's some strange decisions here and the Santa Ynez Mountains, like keeping all of these non-native Peruvian pepper trees and instead getting rid of all of the native shrubs here. But this is an example of, this is also just poor placement of home site. This is it's basically on a ridge line between two slopes, and fires often intensify as they move up slope. This is a dangerous place to build. It's away from the community, the main community of Santa Barbara. It would take firefighters a while to get out to this place. So if a fire is moving pretty quickly through here, it's unlikely that firefighters are even going to be able to work on this structure. So again, addressing where we build is very important, just as much as addressing defensible space. But I think the key thing, and this is the thing that we probably focus the least amount of money and attention on in the US, is retrofitting existing homes with fire safe materials. We've done a pretty good job at replacing roofs. There have been a couple of key fires, especially back in the early 90s, that really pushed the state to start cracking down on what types of roofs are used on homes. And there have been some programs to actually help people replace roofs. And it seems like that's as far as we went, and said, okay, our job is done. We've done a good job here. We've fixed the problem. The problem is we did not fix it. And roofs were definitely one part of the solution, but embers are still getting into homes through vents, open eaves. They're getting under decks and patios, burning, embers are landing in flammable patio materials, furniture, things like that. Not everyone has double paned windows or tempered glass windows. And so if you don't have those, your windows can break and allow embers to get in, especially under these extreme windy conditions. So there's a lot that we still haven't done. And then even where people have made, they've replaced their roof, there can still be weak points. This is a good example of where the terracotta roof here, I'm not sure what these are called, this style here. A lot of times people, there's like this open area, and sometimes you can get, leaf litter and stuff blowing up into there. But this person has sealed it with concrete, which is a really good move here, because embers could get up in there, and if there's anything flammable there, that could be a problem. But the big issue, I think, is vents. A lot of people have vent screens, but they are really wide mesh, and they are simply too large to effectively keep the embers that can actually cause your home to ignite. They're not effective at keeping them out. So this is an attic vent, and I don't know if they have a screen behind what we're seeing here, but this is the kind of thing where you would want like a 2mm mesh screen on all of your vents, and that would really go quite a long ways in keeping embers out of your house. The other thing is not so much about retrofitting homes, but also just maintaining some of these things. This could be, I guess, included in defensible space, how we deal with defensible space, but a lot of people have gutters and they have leaf litter getting into their gutters. I remember I said, you can leave a lot of your mature trees, but if they're overhanging or touching the house, then you have to be careful because of this situation. And that may mean that you have to clean out your gutters pretty consistently, especially during fire season, because these can receive embers really easily. And again, anytime you've got, flames starting to develop anywhere on your home, that can be a problem. What we do know, though, is that if we were to actually invest serious funding into this, we could save a lot of money as a society. So the National Institute of Building Sciences, they have done a lot of research into this, and they found that if you use really conservative estimates, that there's a 2-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. So for every $1 we spend on retrofitting homes, it's to try to prevent home loss from wildfire specifically, we save $2 in post-fire recovery cost, right? So the other thing that I think we don't ever talk about in this country, and maybe it's time that we start at least researching it and exploring it, is the concept of community fire shelters or refuges. This is something that has been gaining a little bit of traction in Australia, where they have a lot of the same wildfire issues that we have here. And it can look something like what we've seen in the Midwest of the US, where tornado shelters, we have their tornado. I grew up right on the edge of Tornado Alley, and I grew up a couple blocks from a community tornado shelter. And when the tornado alerts go off, that shelter automatically unlocks and people can go and take shelter there. I think something similar can be used with wildfire. They have to be built in a very particular way, and they probably have to have air recycling systems, and a lot of measures to keep people safe. But what we're seeing is, like with the Camp Fire in 2018, 85 people died, and a lot of those people died because they were trying to escape town and they got stuck on the road and they died in their car. And that is not something that we want to see ever in these situations. And so that part of that is improving alert and evacuation systems, but there are going to be some situations, some neighborhoods, and some conditions when fires are moving so fast that giving them a place to go in that circumstance that does not involve trying to leave the community entirely may be the safer option. But we haven't really even explored this as an option in this country. The other thing, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of the large and destructive fires that we've seen in Southern California and in Northern California in recent years have been caused by power line ignitions. And this is something that we can address. We have the ability as humans who built these things to make sure that they can withstand high, extreme wind conditions. Retrofitting sort of old and failing equipment is an important part of, I think, this entire conversation. And these utility companies need to be held accountable for their failure to maintain this equipment. And what they tend to focus on is instead just trying to cut trees around their utility lines. But I have seen some really crazy things, and I'll just give you one example. In the Los Padres National Forest a couple of years ago, PG&E had a line. I think this might have been in San Luis Obispo County, actually. Their line was sagging, and it was below. There's a sort of a regulation where there has to be a certain amount of distance between the vegetation and the line. And instead of trying to fix the sagging line, what they were proposing and what they eventually did was excavate the land underneath the line to bring that level down. So that is what we're dealing with. A lot of cost cutting, corner cutting and trying to save costs. That's not what's going to help protect people and communities. If you want to read more about some of these solutions, you can check out this report that we published last year. I co-authored it with a couple of other folks, and we talk all about this idea of working from the home outward, and not trying to focus so much time and money and effort on doing backcountry, remote, vegetation removal and fuel reduction, but instead focusing those funds in communities and on homes themselves. And as I say all of this, the Los Padres National Forest just proposed a massive project to do exactly the things that I just mentioned were not very effective in preventing community damage under these extreme conditions. And we're seeing this project that the Forest Service is proposing. It's 235,000 acres of the Los Padres National Forest, 186,000 acres of which are would be basically fuel breaks, like I showed you earlier, including all along West Cuesta Ridge. So all the red you see is part of this project proposal, and essentially the entirety of West Cuesta Ridge, at least what is managed by the Los Padres National Forest, would be included in this for all this vegetation removal. And as we've seen, again, time and time again, these projects do not work to slow or prevent fires from moving across the landscape under extreme weather conditions. So that's all I have, really. I'm happy to take questions. I wanted to leave some time for questions. Hopefully we can take a few here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Bryant. We have one question. We understand that there is a proposal or a webinar that you're going to be giving next week to detail a little bit on this Forest Service proposal. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'll be giving a webinar on Tuesday at noon. It's free to attend. The link I will put in the. How can I do this? I'm gonna type the answer. Hopefully everyone can see this. The link would be lpfw.org/ERP webinar, I believe. I hope this is the right link to the registration. So folks might have to copy and paste that. You can also just email me if you'd like. My email is bryant@lpfw.org. And yeah, please sign up for that. I will explain what the Forest Service is actually proposing and go over some of the specific areas that are threatened under this proposal, and talk a little bit more about what we should be doing instead. So thank you.
Is this this coming Tuesday, like tomorrow?
No, sorry, next Tuesday. I think that's the 16th. Is that right?
The 16th.
Yep.
Okay. Another question. Do you know if other communities have had success in addressing private land ownership and development in high wildland fire areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. One example that I often point to is the city of Monrovia right on the edge of LA. So this is right on the edge of the San Gabriel Mountains. And what they did, gosh, I don't remember how many years ago this was. This was in the early 2000s, I want to say. They created this bond measure to actually try to buy up properties that were in this wildland urban interface area that had not been developed yet, but were probably going to be developed, in terms of building new homes and structures. And so the city actually bought those properties and then turned them into a city wilderness park, basically. And so it maintained that sort of wildland area and didn't put homes into those places that were likely to burn. And what's fascinating is that area, when was that? 2020, the Bobcat fire burned right down into the same exact places where they had bought up land, but it didn't make it to the community itself. But if homes had been built there, if they hadn't bought up those properties, very well they could have burned in the Bobcat fire. So it is possible. They didn't do that specifically to try to prevent development from a fire risk perspective, but that's what essentially happened as a result. And they've sort of acknowledged that, since then, said, well, this was good on a lot of different levels. We have, more city parkland that people can go and enjoy and explore. But we also kept people from building in dangerous places. It's just not something that people are putting a lot of money into at the local or state level. And I think, that's more of an incentive program or more of a program where people are buying up properties. The cities are buying up properties, but I think we're also going to have to address how areas are zoned in the first place. That's going to be important as well.
Well, that's actually thank you, Bryant. That's actually a good segue into the next question, and that is, what is the value of installing metal roofs for fire safety? And maybe I could amend that to say in installing fireproof or fire resistant roofs.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what you mean by value. I think the value is that it can pretty drastically increase the odds that your home survives. I will say, before the 90s, homes that were burning in wildfire, often it was still embers getting into the house, but there were plenty of examples where it was actually like wood shake, shingle roofs that were igniting, and that was not helping the situation. Metal roofs, I think, can be effective. It just all depends on the rest of the house. And this is maybe this is the better way to put it, is that you could have the most fire resistant home on earth. It can be basically fireproof, but if you leave your door open when you evacuate, all of that goes out the window, right? If you leave a window open, it literally goes out the window, right? So everything, when you retrofit a home, it needs to be in a holistic manner if possible. If you can't do that, then I certainly think addressing certain things first. If you don't have a fire resistant roof, a non-combustible roof, I would definitely try to start with that if you can. But cheaper things that you can start with are vent screens, are relatively cheap. And move on to windows from there. Those are often weak points. Embers get in through vents and they get in through windows. So having double pane tempered glass windows is important, but having those vent screens is really important as well. Also, just sealing up cracks, sealing up areas, especially around doors. Your home is basically a vacuum under these conditions because it's cooler on the inside and it's hotter on the outside, right? And so it's sort of sucking embers in. And so you want to try to eliminate those places where embers could potentially get in. And one thing I'll say is if you go around your home right now and you see where leaves and things seem to pile up because of wind, just imagine that that's also where embers are probably going to go because of wind, right? Those are what we call ember webs. You can sort of predict where embers are going to be going around your property based on where you see things naturally piling up.
Great. Thank you. Another question: what happens to this biomass that is being removed or treated in these fire breaks? Is it lost to the local landscape? And what are the consequences of that action or that activity?
So in chaparral dominated areas, which is what some of those field breaks I showed you, that would be a lot of West Gloucester Ridge. What would most likely happen is the use of masticators, like I showed you, basically grinding things down into mulch. And then that mulch is essentially left on site. And there have actually been some studies that have looked at this from a future fire risk perspective. And they found like, hey, you're just converting your, one fuel type to a different fuel type. And it can also be flammable as well. So taking a bunch of native shrubs and then turning them into mulch doesn't necessarily reduce fire risk in that spot. So that's one way. In areas where there's more trees or larger shrubs, you'll often see a lot of cutting and then piling, and then they'll do pile burning at some point. I should have included, I have a great photo of an area that had just got turned into a fuel break near somewhere in the Cleveland National Forest down, I think in Orange County. And there was just a bunch of piles all over the fuel break after they had done it. And so those will eventually be burned, is the idea there. And that may take a while because they have to have perfect weather conditions to do that kind of burning. In forested areas, they often will, you can do it in multiple ways. Like in this project that I mentioned that the Los Padres is proposing, they, for the 186,000 acres that are, designated as fuel breaks, if those overlap with areas that have a lot of trees, then you can remove, they can remove trees of any size. There's potential that could be done in a commercial manner so that trees are actually sold. It's unclear exactly what would happen, but most likely in most situations, I think it would be probably cutting and piling and then burning eventually. Go ahead.
Well, that begs another question. Why does the Forest Service and other agencies, why do they do this kind of clear cutting and fire breaks if there's such evidence that they don't work?
Fire is big business in California and across the West, and it's not always in the ways that you think. When a fire breaks out and you have like the incident command sort of forms for that fire, and they're making decisions about what to do. Especially if a fire is moving really fast and it's, growing many thousands of acres per day or even per hour, usually what they'll do is they'll send out bulldozers to distant ridge lines, and they'll just start dozing these ridges, and those are called fire breaks. And often that's being done through this sort of contracting basis. So you get these like private contractors are getting hired by CAL FIRE, for example, to go out and do this work. And there's a lot of money going into fire suppression. If you look at how much we spend trying to suppress various fires, I mean, it's kind of staggering to see the hundreds of millions of dollars going to them. The Sobranes fire, 2016, that was up in Big Sur. That cost over $200 million to try to suppress. And a lot of that was unnecessary suppression activities that didn't do much good in the grand scheme of things. And there have been some interesting sort of post-fire analysis of what was actually done that was useful and what was done that wasn't useful. But one of the reasons they make these fuel breaks is that it's easier to doze them later. And that's what we see over and over and over again, that the very first thing that happens when a fire breaks out is that those existing fuel breaks, those are the first places where they send bulldozers typically. And so we see that like in the Camino Cielo fuel break that I showed you in the San Ynez Mountains, that's been bulldozed. I don't know. It seems like once every few years because a fire breaks out somewhere in the region, and bulldozers, very first thing that happens. There's a lot of money going around for that. CAL FIRE as a state agency, I mean, it's like our largest state agency. I mean, it's massive. It has a huge, huge budget. There are billions and billions of dollars going to all of this type of work. Congress keeps appropriating more money to the Forest Service to do more and more of this type of work. And one thing my colleague always says is, so you're running faster. That's great. But if you're running in the wrong direction, that's not going to get you where you need to go any sooner. Right. And that seems to be the MO here, is that we keep pumping money into these things that haven't been working because those pipelines for pumping money into them exist. But it's not getting us anywhere in terms of actually increasing community safety. So that's, there's a lot of politics here. There's a lot to it. And I could probably do an entire presentation just on why is all this happening, but I'll save that for another time.
Okay, well, and that actually is a nice little segue into the next question. And that is, given the fact that fires appear to be increasing in number and intensity in recent years, is there really value in preventing fires in forest for forest health? And what would be the most effective ways of doing that?
That's a good question. It's quite literally a topic that I've given entire presentations on, and I'm not sure how well I could answer. I guess one thing to think about first of all is that we have 27 different forest types in California, and each of them has a different natural fire regime and is affected by current modern fires differently. So what occurs in closed cone pine cypress forests, like what you've got in Cambria, for example, or up in Monterey, is different than what occurs in redwood forest or mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada or lodgepole pine forest at higher elevation. Every single one of them is different, and how we deal with fire there is going to be different. So it's hard for me to give a blanket answer. But what I will say is that in a lot of these forest types, particularly mixed conifer and dry ponderosa or Jeffrey pine forest, in a lot of places, there's still less fire currently than there was historically. And suppressing fire doesn't really fix that issue very well. And again, what we see, and I could have included this stat too, 95% of all the community damage is caused by 0.12% of fires in a given year, right? It's almost the same percentage if you look at it from a burned acreage perspective as well. Only a handful of fires account for most of the burned acreage in any given year, including in forest. And that is usually under extreme weather conditions, under which a lot of this type of work, suppression isn't very effective. It's hard to suppress fires under those conditions. And doing work before the fire ever occurs, doing this like sort of fire prevention work often doesn't work either. Those conditions overwhelm those forest activities. So I think we need to reevaluate how we think about fires in forest. I've spent a lot of time in post-fire forested ecosystems. They're some of the most magical places I've ever been. Incredibly biodiverse. Most forests have what's called a mixed severity fire regime. So you have areas that burn really hot and most of the trees die. And then you also have areas where hardly any of the trees die. And it's that mixture of different fire effects that actually creates really biodiverse landscapes and habitat heterogeneity. Trying to prevent that from occurring on the landscape can be ecologically damaging. But again, it's different for every forest type, and it certainly is different in chaparral, especially in Southern California, where we actually do see that a lot of areas, because of human-caused ignitions, they are burning too frequently. And we have seen that chaparral, some species are disappearing because they literally cannot keep up with that fire interval. But a lot of the things that are being proposed by these agencies doesn't address that either. The only thing that would really address that is preventing human-caused ignitions, which we can do better at across the board. I hope that answers your question, at least in part. But feel free if perhaps when someone sends out the link to my webinar, if you guys could send my email address, tell people, they're welcome to get in touch with me, and I can send them more resources.
Okay, thank you, Bryant. We will do that. Kim has said right here, we will put a link on the league website, and the connection to this webinar will be out in the next communication from the league, which is our voter, along with a link to replay this if people want to watch this recorded presentation. So I think that takes us to our conclusion. Again, Bryant, thank you so much for being able to give us this information, and we thank everybody for your attendance, and we will see you again.
Thank you
very much.